Speaking of politicians, Pelosi is your congresswoman. I would imagine that she doesn't really pay any attention to this, much less anything. Could you talk about just the complete disconnect that our elected officials really have to these types of issues? I mean, there are some that are good. Ro Khanna is good.
Yeah,
Katie Ford is good.
And there are some that are good, and they are also, the good ones are faced with dealing with now a large group of insane ones who are not only stupid but evil, and that's not a great situation. But again, it traces back to the broken educational system.
Yes.
One of the worst of the insurrectionists, the traitors that promoted the attack on our capital, got a bachelor's degree from Stanford University, to our utter dismay and disgust. But in part, it's because the university it's probably the best university in the world, and it would be an excellent university for the 19th century. Whether Stanford could ever be dragged into the 20th century is still an open question. It has got no leadership in that direction at all. And you can get all the way through Stanford University, the best university in the world, without knowing what natural capital is, without knowing what the laws of thermodynamics are, without knowing anything basically about how the world works, particularly if you major in the econ department, where there's only one faculty member who understands how the world works. And that's out of dozens.
Considering you've lived quite an extraordinary life, you were born in the Depression, you've lived through multiple wars. I'm curious if there was a particular point in our history where you kind of looked at that moment and said, yeah, this is pretty much where things really started going to hell. I mean, I always point to Jack's assassination as the moment where the country really changed, and it kind of hasn't been the same since then. There was a succession of issues that happened.
I love how he says that like he was there. Like he remembers that.
I'm sure that Paul remembers November 22nd, 1963 very well, but I'm also sure that there may have been other moments. So I'm curious, from your perspective, what would you say really was sort of that, if there was one particular moment where you said, yeah, this is really not going to go well for us?
It was more my interest in the Second World War. My brain was not fully myelinated during the Second World War because I had not yet gotten to the late 20s, when your brain is finally where it physically grown to the point where it should. So I wanted to fight in it. I wished the war would last until I could get into it, because the propaganda was such. But what really led me down the drain was when I started to learn what was going on in terms of the environment and in terms of nuclear war. I was interested in the, I became a pilot. I was not a pilot at the time, but I was during the war very interested in the air forces and the airplanes and so on. And when I started to read about what happened, and particularly the firestorms in the bombing of Hamburg, and in bombing Japanese cities and so on, and I began to put that together with nuclear weapons, I began to understand that we were in a position to actually destroy the entire world, that we could wipe out almost everybody, maybe everybody. And of course, my training was in evolutionary biology and in where human beings came from. That's what I used to lecture on. The way I got involved with the population bomb was that I lectured. I had a 10-week course in evolution. The first 9 weeks were where people had come from, and the last week was where people were going. And those lectures became well known to Stanford students and alumni, and I started getting invitations to talk on Bay Area radio shows and so on about population and the environment. And Dave Brower, who was he was famous for his work in the Sierra Club, and Ian Ballantyne, who invented the pocketbook and was working with Dave on environmental books, came to Ann and me and said, could you write down what you've been saying in your lectures in a short book, and we'll see if we can influence the election in 1968 and show how naive even people like Dave and Ian could be. But Ann and I spent a couple of weeks writing it down, and that's where the population bomb came from. And to my continued dismay and disgust, I allowed Ian to say the book will be much better if it only has one author. And so Ann and I decided we'd leave her name off, which was a big mistake as far as I'm concerned. The book may have sold better with only one name, but anyway, we're 65 years into the argument now, so I guess we managed to survive it. But
a lot of people may or may not know the full trajectory of Reagan's presidency. Could you talk about what it was like having him as your governor, and perhaps where people may not recognize that he had a lot to do with a lot of the, I think from an environmental standpoint, he was really somebody who kind of just revolutionized this whole concept of, you're an individual, get yours while you can, and run over everybody you have to in order to get it if need be.
That's a time that that's what I thought we started going backwards. In other words, if you think about it, even Nixon, for example, he was a crook, but he was a smart politician and realized that there was importance in environmental issues. And during his administration, the Republicans started to put in what, on a worldwide basis, they were inadequate, but they were the first laws trying to deal with clean air, clean water, biodiversity, and so on. And Reagan just reversed it. And then, of course, it went steadily downhill from there with some minor changes. But I have to admit that I've known a lot of people in politics. I have had friends in both the Senate and the House and so on. And we all sort of used to think of ourselves as knowledgeable about, after all, if you're interested in the environment, you know that the big issues are political. The changes that have to be made are not, we don't need to know any more science to know what we ought to be doing. We already know what we ought to be doing. The issue is, why in hell aren't we doing it? But none of us, I don't have a single friend who would claim that he foresaw what a disaster Trump could create. I mean, that is beyond belief, and it's still beyond belief. I mean, after all, you have hundreds of morons in political positions in Washington who refuse to even look at the causes of something we all observed and almost wiped them out. I mean, the levels of evil and stupidity that have been created by Donald, whatever his name is, are beyond belief. And I feel really, by the way, I once met Joe Biden, had a very high opinion of him. Ann and I had a discussion with him in an empty stairwell on Lake Como in Italy. He would never remember it. He was a senator at the time, but we were both impressed. But he is faced basically with what Abraham Lincoln was faced with, if you know the history of the 1840s, 50s, and 60s.
He does, because he's that guy.
And I must say, I think he's done a wonderful job, better than I thought he would. But boy, it's a knife-edge issue whether we're just going to go down the drain politically and not do anything at all about the existential threats to humanity and to our children.
Thanks for watching. If you want to support our mission to transform politics into service, please like this video, subscribe, follow us on social media, and consider joining our Patreon, where you'll get early access to our interviews as well as other exclusive content. Links are in the description. Peace out.